All right, welcome everyone to today's deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We're going to be looking at something you might not expect,
Okay.
the New Deal,
Interesting.
but not the,
Yeah.
the economic programs we usually hear about.
Right. Okay.
It's a surprising connection to the rise of the modern law and order state.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the side of the New Deal that often gets overlooked.
Yeah.
But as we'll see, it has had a profound impact on how we think about crime,
Yeah.
justice, and the role of government in American society.
Absolutely. So our guide for this deep dive
Yeah.
is an interview with Anthony Gregory,
Okay.
author of New Deal Law and Order
Right.
from the American History Hit podcast.
Okay.
Now, I don't know about you, but I always thought of the New Deal as a response to the Great Depression.
Yeah, me too.
But it turns out there was a whole other crisis going on at the same time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a crisis of lawlessness.
That's right. Before the 1930s, America was a much wilder place. Rampant crime, public acceptance of lawlessness,
Yeah.
figures like Al Capone being seen as almost folk heroes.
It's hard to believe.
It was a time when trusting law enforcement was unusual,
Yeah.
and crime felt like an unavoidable part of life.
Yeah, it's almost hard to imagine living in a time when people were more likely to admire gangsters than the police.
Yeah, no, it's crazy, right? So how did the New Deal change all that?
Well, amidst its focus on economic recovery,
Uh-huh.
the New Deal also responded to this crisis of lawlessness.
Okay.
And a key figure in this story is Attorney General Homer Cummings.
Okay.
He saw the need for a more powerful federal response to crime,
Yeah.
and he found a willing partner in J. Edgar Hoover,
Oh, wow.
the ambitious director of the then Bureau of Investigation.
So the FBI, as we know it today,
That's right.
really owes its existence to the New Deal.
Exactly.
Wow. I'm curious, what were some of the specific ways in which the New Deal transformed law enforcement?
Well, Cummings and Hoover worked together to really expand the FBI's power and reach.
Okay.
They pushed to arm the FBI,
Wow.
granted them more authority to pursue criminals across state lines,
Mm-hmm.
and made the FBI a key intelligence agency.
Mm.
It's fascinating because Cummings wasn't actually FDR's first choice for Attorney General.
Really?
Yeah, had things gone differently, who knows?
Yeah.
The FBI as we know it might not even exist.
It makes you wonder about all the twists and turns of history, right?
That's amazing.
So the New Deal gave us the FBI,
Uh-huh.
but it also did something else that's incredibly important.
What's that?
It marked the beginning of the war on crime rhetoric
Oh, right.
that still dominates our political discourse today.
That's an important point.
Yeah.
This wasn't just about catching criminals.
Yeah.
It was about creating a whole new way of thinking about crime as an enemy to be fought, a war to be won.
And that way of thinking, it's really stuck with us, hasn't it?
Absolutely.
Think about the debates we have today about the role of the FBI,
Yeah.
federal power, even gun control.
So many of those discussions have their roots in the New Deal's focus on law and order.
I think you're absolutely right.
The New Deal also significantly changed the balance of power between the federal government and the states.
That's another big one.
Yeah.
They used a broader interpretation of the Interstate Commerce Clause, which allowed them to play a much larger role in areas that were previously considered state issues, including crime.
That seems like a really important legal shift.
It was.
Can you give us some examples of how this played out in practice?
Sure, one striking example is the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937.
Okay.
They effectively criminalized marijuana at the federal level
Wow.
without even needing a constitutional amendment.
That's a pretty powerful example of how they used this expanded interpretation of the Interstate Commerce Clause to really reshape the legal landscape.
It is. It really is.
Were there other examples?
Oh, yes. Take the 1934 and 1938 Firearms Acts,
Okay.
which marked early federal forays into gun control. Again, using this broader interpretation of the Interstate Commerce Clause.
So this seemingly technical change
Yeah.
really revolutionized the balance of power between states and the federal government.
That's right.
It's the foundation for so many federal laws we take for granted today,
Yeah,
from drug policy to gun control.
absolutely.
It's amazing how these legal maneuvers from the 1930s
Yeah.
are still resonating in our debates today.
I know. It's incredible.
And it wasn't just about passing laws, though, was it?
No.
The New Deal also saw the creation of
It was
It
complicated.
wasn't just about being tough on crime.
Right.
It was also about redefining the relationship between citizens and the state,
Absolutely.
trying to find that balance between individual liberties and government power.
Exactly.
Sounds like a complicated time,
It was.
full of contradictions.
Uh-huh.
And speaking of contradictions,
Oh.
what about that story I heard about Coca-Cola and its exemption from the cocaine ban?
Ah, yes. Coca-Cola actually used to contain cocaine.
Wow.
And when the drug was banned,
Mhm.
they were allowed to keep using coca leaves.
Really?
Yeah, this illustrates how even iconic brands got caught up in this shifting landscape of drug policy.
And it also shows how the government's role in regulating consumer products was evolving. You were becoming much more interventionist.
Right. It's a fascinating example of how the government was grappling with its role in American life during this period.
So we've got economic turmoil,
Yeah.
social change,
Uh-huh.
and a government trying to figure out how to keep people safe,
Yeah.
all happening at the same time.
A lot going on.
So it sounds like the New Deal's impact on law enforcement was pretty massive.
It was huge.
But how did the public react to all of this?
That's a good question.
They didn't exactly trust law enforcement before the New Deal.
That's true.
Right.
But one of the most remarkable achievements of the New Deal was how it actually built public faith in law enforcement.
It's quite a turnaround.
It is.
How did they manage to pull that off?
Well, it was a combination of factors.
Okay.
The visible crackdown on gangsters like John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde played a role.
Okay.
The media turned these FBI takedowns into sensational news stories. It was like they were creating crime-fighting celebrities.
So it was partly about spectacle,
Yeah,
about creating a sense of excitement around law enforcement,
right.
but there was more to it than that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The New Deal also brought about a professionalization of law enforcement.
Okay.
They invested in training, standardized procedures,
Mhm.
even created crime labs.
Wow.
It was all about presenting a more modern scientific approach to fighting crime.
So it wasn't just about catching the bad guys.
Nope.
It was about changing the image of law enforcement, making
Exactly.
them seem more competent and reliable.
Right.
And this wasn't just happening at the federal level.
No.
Cummings and Hoover also worked hard to foster cooperation between state and local law enforcement agencies.
That's right.
They encouraged information sharing, joint task forces,
Hmm.
even provided federal funding to support local crime-fighting initiatives.
Yep, they're building a whole new system.
So it was about creating a more unified, nationwide approach to law enforcement.
It was.
And by doing so, they really shifted the public's perception of who was responsible for keeping them safe.
That's right.
It was no longer just the local sheriff.
Yeah,
It was the federal government stepping in as a powerful protector.
exactly. And that shift in perception, that feeling of security provided by a more powerful federal government,
Yeah.
that's a legacy that continues to shape our political landscape today.
It's fascinating how something that happened decades ago can still have such a powerful influence on us today.
It really is.
But before we get too deep into that,
Okay.
let's take a quick break.
All right.
When we come back, we'll explore some of the less celebrated aspects of the New Deal's impact on law and order.
Sounds good. Welcome back to our deep dive into the New Deal's impact on law and order.
So you're telling me the New Deal wasn't all sunshine and rainbows when it came to fighting crime?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's right.
Hmm.
While the New Deal did have some positive effects, there were also some unintended consequences and criticisms that are important to understand.
For example, I've heard that the New Deal's law and order policies ended up disproportionately harming marginalized communities.
That's true, yes, unfortunately.
Is that true?
Yes, it's a complex issue, but one of the main criticisms is that these policies, whether intentionally or not,
Yeah.
ended up targeting and harming marginalized communities,
Mm-hmm.
especially African Americans.
Can you tell us a bit more about that? How did this play out?
Well, sometimes it was about the biases embedded in the laws themselves and how they were enforced.
Yeah.
Take the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937.
Yeah.
On the surface, it was about taxes,
Right?
but it was widely seen as a way to target Mexican American and Black communities.
So it wasn't just about raising revenue.
No, it was about controlling certain groups.
It's a prime example of how seemingly neutral laws can have deeply discriminatory consequences.
Exactly, and this pattern repeated itself in other areas as well.
Right.
Vagrancy laws, for instance, were used to criminalize poverty and homelessness,
Uh-huh.
which again disproportionately affected people of color.
And this was happening at the same time that federal law enforcement powers were expanding.
Right.
And police forces were becoming more professionalized.
Exactly. So you have this combination of factors that created a perfect storm. More powerful law enforcement agencies using new technologies and tactics, all operating within a system that was already biased against certain groups.
That sounds like a recipe for trouble.
It was.
And I imagine the consequences of this system are still being felt today.
You're absolutely right. Mass incarceration, racial profiling, police brutality, these are all issues with roots in this era.
Okay, so that's a pretty heavy legacy.
It is.
But you also mentioned unintended consequences.
Yeah.
What were some other unforeseen outcomes of this focus on crime fighting?
Well, here's something ironic. One unintended consequence was that it actually contributed to the rise of organized crime, the very thing they were trying to combat.
Wait, how is that possible? I don't get it.
Think about it. Prohibition had already created a massive black market for alcohol.
Right.
When the government stepped up its efforts to enforce it, they basically created a vacuum that organized crime was perfectly positioned to fill.
So by trying to crack down on illegal booze, they made organized crime stronger.
That's a good way to put it.
And it didn't end with Prohibition either.
No, it didn't.
The networks and infrastructure of organized crime remained.
Yeah.
They just shifted focus to other illegal activities like gambling or drugs.
Right. It's like squeezing a balloon. The air just moves somewhere else.
So we've got racial injustice
Yeah.
and a boost for organized crime.
Uh-huh.
Were there other negative consequences?
Another big concern was the potential erosion of civil liberties.
Hmm.
The New Deal was a time of crisis, and there was a feeling that something drastic had to be done.
Right.
In that context, some argue that individual freedoms were sacrificed in the name of security.
It's that age-old dilemma. How much freedom are we willing to give up for safety? What were some of the ways that civil liberties were affected during this period?
Well, we didn't see widespread violations of due process or censorship,
Okay.
but there were definitely instances where the line was blurred.
Oh.
For example, the FBI under Hoover engaged in extensive surveillance of political activists,
Mm-hmm.
labor organizers, even civil rights leaders.
They weren't just monitoring them either.
No, they weren't.
There were intimidation tactics, spreading of disinformation, even attempts to disrupt and discredit these groups.
That's right. It raises questions about what can happen when law enforcement agencies have too much power.
So basically spying on people who were exercising their right to free speech.
Basically.
That's pretty unsettling.
It is.
And raises questions about what can happen when law enforcement agencies have too much power, especially during times of crisis.
Exactly.
And it's important to remember the expansion of federal power wasn't just limited to law enforcement.
You're right. It wasn't.
You're talking about the shift in the balance of power between the federal government and the states.
Exactly.
And while this had some positive results, like the implementation of Social Security,
Right.
it also raised concerns about federal overreach.
It did.
So it's a trade-off. More federal power can be good in some areas,
Uh-huh.
but it also has the potential to step on individual liberties and state rights.
That's right. And this is a tension that we're still grappling with today. Think about debates about who controls things like healthcare, education, or environmental regulations.
Right.
These all have roots in the New Deal era.
Wow. This is a lot to process.
It is.
It sounds like the New Deal, while aimed at creating a better society,
Yeah,
also had some significant downsides.
it did.
How should we be thinking about this legacy today?
It's important to remember that history is complicated.
Yeah.
The New Deal was a response to a very specific set of circumstances,
Uh,
but by understanding the complexities,
Yeah.
the good and the bad,
yeah.
we can learn from it and hopefully avoid repeating the same mistakes.
It's a lot to think about.
It is a lot to consider.
So what can we learn from all of this? How does this history inform our understanding of the issues we face today?
That's a great question, and that's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll look at how the New Deal's legacy continues to shape our world and what lessons we can take away from this fascinating period in American history.
Okay. So we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into the New Deal's impact on law and order. We've covered a lot of ground already, from gangsters to gun control. But I think what really struck me is how much of this history is still relevant today.
Yeah, it's not just a history lesson. It's like we're seeing the echoes of the New Deal in so many of the debates we're having right now about crime, justice, and the role of government.
Exactly. Like take police reform, for example. We're talking about accountability, racial bias, use of force, all issues that have deep roots in the era we've been discussing.
Right. And it's not just about the police. The whole way we approach crime and punishment in America is shaped by the New Deal. That emphasis on federal power, on aggressive law enforcement, on harsh penalties, that's a legacy that's hard to shake off, even as we try to move towards a more just and equitable system.
So it's like the New Deal created this framework for dealing with crime, and we're still kind of trapped in it, even if we recognize that it's not working as well as it should.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And the challenge is to figure out how to move beyond that framework, to learn from the mistakes of the past and find new ways to address these really complex issues.
So are you saying we need to, like, totally rethink our approach to crime?
Well, I think we need to be open to new ideas for sure. Instead of just focusing on punishment, we need to be thinking about prevention, about addressing the root causes of crime, like poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity. And instead of just reacting after the fact, we need to be investing in things like community policing, restorative justice, programs that build trust and help people get back on their feet.
Okay, so shifting the focus from punishment to prevention and from reaction to proactive solutions. It makes sense, but it also sounds like a pretty big shift.
It is a big shift, but I think it's one we need to make if we want to create a truly just and equitable society.
And it's not just about changing policies, right? It's also about changing mindsets.
Absolutely. We have to start seeing people, even those who have committed crimes, as human beings worthy of dignity and respect. And we have to be willing to invest in their rehabilitation and reintegration into society.
That's a powerful message. And it's something that I think we can all take away from this deep dive. It's about recognizing the complexities of history, understanding how the past shapes the present, and then using that knowledge to create a better future.
Exactly. And it's about engaging in these conversations, even if they're uncomfortable, even if they challenge our assumptions, because that's how we learn, how we grow, and how we move forward together.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So to everyone listening, if you want to learn more about this fascinating era and its relevance to today's issues, I highly recommend checking out Anthony Gregory's book, New Deal Law and Order.
It's a great starting point for anyone who wants to understand the roots of our current criminal justice system.
And remember, this conversation doesn't end here. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep learning. Because the past may be behind us, but its influence is always with us.
And it's up to us to decide what kind of legacy we want to create for the future.
Well said. Until next time, fellow deep divers, keep exploring.